Truth be told, the right-wing governments of the 1980s were not terribly successful in their policies. Inflation did come down, but unemployment rose and stayed way up for quite a while. Much more so in Europe and America, but even so for quite a while. Productivity growth did not speed up. The income distribution became massively more unequal. Their belief had been that a tax cut was the pressure point to accomplish hard-right neoliberal reforms, but things definitely did not turn out as expected. They sought to reduce the size of the government. The chosen instrument was to enforce a reduction in the size of the government was a tax cut, for tax cuts are always popular. A new tax cut enacted by a new president in the United States would be very popular and, politicians and strategists calculated, would greatly weaken opposition to subsequent spending cuts. For the alternative proposed by those who wish to maintain spending would then necessarily include large budget deficits or, as a consequence, unless the tax cuts were reversed. Moreover, the tax cut would have the added benefit of tilting the distribution of income in favor of the rich. Social democracy's problem, remember, was it did not treat unequals sufficiently unequally. Industry should be rewarded and sloth punished. The rich were industrious. Moreover, the rich saved and invested, thus enriching everybody in the future. The third principle, therefore, was to tilt the distribution of income in favor of the rich by cutting their taxes most. Yet things did not work out well. For one thing, in the short run of the early 1980s, the Reagan administration planned a massive buildup of the armed forces, and thus an expansion, not a contraction of the size of the government. For another, there was a great unwillingness on the part of both Reagan and Thatcher to identify in advance which programs and subsidies would be cut in the shrinking of the government that the administration-to-be had planned. To reduce anxiety, politicians looked benignly on and encouraged the growth of the story that no spending cuts at all would be required. The tax cut alone and the lifting of the hand of regulation from the economy would create such a spur of economic growth that even domestic programs could be expanded and contracted. No one with a quantitative grasp of the government's budget and its pattern of change ever meant the story to be taken seriously, but administration policymakers under Reagan welcomed its dissemination. Policy elites assured each other their candidate would say a lot of silly things before the election, but that the candidate and his principal advisors understood the important issue. Tax cuts were to be followed by a ruthless attack against weak claims on the federal budget. Farm subsidies, student loans that went to the rich, the exemption from taxation of Social Security income for the rich, the subsidization of the Southwest Water Project, and so forth, those would be slashed to balance the budget. Weak claimants, people for whom government subsidies and assistance truly served as a safety net, would be protected, while weak claims would be reduced. But too many of the Reagan administration's allies and supporters claimed after the election that they had taken this story very seriously indeed. They would not support spending cuts, for they were the weak claims whose subsidies and programs were to be targeted for reduction. These two factors, the expansion of the military budget and the claim by key legislators and influence peddlers that the Republican trip they had purchased was not for a tax cut and a spending cut, but just for a tax cut alone, left the United States with large and only gradually controlled budget deficits throughout the 1980s. In 1982 and 1983, those were perhaps useful in boosting a depressed economy, but from 1984 on, they drained the pool of savings available to fund investment in America and materially slowed American economic growth. Too many of the Reagan administration's allies and supporters claimed after the election that they had taken this story seriously, that no spending cuts would be necessary. They would not support spending cuts. They were, after all, the weak claimants whose subsidies and programs were supposed to have been targeted for reduction. These two factors, the expansion of the military budget and the claim by key legislators and influence peddlers that the Republican trip they had purchased was just for a tax cut, left the United States with large and only gradually controlled budget deficits throughout the 1980s. Previous decades had seen 1 or perhaps 2 years of large and useful budget deficits and recessions to push spending up or to cushion its fall. Previously, large budget deficits had only been seen when there was a macroeconomic purpose. But there was no macroeconomic purpose after 1984, and yet the large budget deficits, very large by the standards of the post-World War II era, persisted throughout the years of prosperity and low unemployment as well. These large budget deficits became a drag on the American economy. Funds saved might not now be invested. They might be borrowed by the government and used for current spending. The large deficits of the 1980s reduced the rate at which the United States capital stock grew. They reduced economic growth by half a percentage point or so. This was bitter for those who'd worked very hard to elect a Republican administration because they thought Democratic administrations were pursuing policies that reduced investment in and thus impoverished America's future. Because, quote, the long-run benefits of investment are, quote, apparently lie beyond the political horizon, unquote, as my teacher Marty Feldstein said. Beyond, that is, the Democrats' political horizon. They had hoped to elect an administration committed to increasing savings and investment, to lowering taxes on those who did save and invest in order to empower America's future. Yet the Reagan deficits were an order of magnitude more destructive of America's economic future than any of the inflationary, redistributive, or regulatory policies pursued by Democrats had been. But for Republican influencers and influence peddlers, for Republican intellectuals as opposed to technocrats, the fact that the policies were pro-rich and that the distribution of wealth was shifted strongly toward the rich, it greatly pleased the audience that mattered to them. Yet there were more indirect consequences of the budget deficits in the context of the stepping back from the United States as its role of Bretton Woods hegemon in the world economy of the 1980s. For more than half of the 1980s, the high budget deficits raised interest rates in the United States and led to the US dollar being substantially overvalued, as the US budget deficit sucked in capital from outside as well as inside and raised the value of the currency. When a domestic industry's costs are greater than the prices at which foreign firms can sell, the market is sending the domestic industry a signal. It should shrink. Foreigners are producing with more relative efficiency, and the resources used in the domestic industry should be transferred to some other sector where domestic producers do have a comparative advantage. This was the signal that the market system sent to all U.S. manufacturing industries in the 1980s, that they should cut back on investment and shrink. In this case, it was a false signal, sent out not by the market's interpretation of the logic of comparative advantage, but by the extraordinary short-run demand of cash to borrow from the U.S. government, and to borrow for no good purpose except to prevent the Reagan administration from having to actually face the question of what federal spending it would cut in order to fund its tax cuts. But firms responded to this signal even so. The U.S. sectors producing tradable goods shrank. A good deal of the ground lost would never be recovered. The American industrial Midwest began to turn itself into the Rust Belt that we know of today. And there was the turn of the business cycle. Full employment was no longer a priority. And in order to make full employment no longer a priority and still make sense of the world, people had to believe that full employment was no longer a priority because it had never needed to be a priority. That the market system had, unless extraordinary events intervened, a natural propensity to rapidly return economies back to full employment. As the 1980s and as the 1990s turned into the 1990s, it became increasingly clear that serious dangers were produced by the freedom of international trade and international investment and international finance that had followed the collapse of Bretton Woods in the 1970s and the rollback of regulation in the 1980s, in a context in which people expected the market giveth, the market taketh away, blessed be the name of the market, that adverse business cycles would be quickly corrected unless they had some deep structural and necessary cause. The 1980s saw one major international financial crisis, the Third World Debt Crisis that followed 1982. The 1990s saw three, approximately 2.5 years apart: the collapse of the European monetary system in 1992, the Mexican peso crisis of 1994-95, the East Asian crisis of 1997-1998, and then there have many that have followed since, the largest being the Great Recession of 2007 to 2010. The reaction to the first such crisis, the debt crisis that followed 1982, was that it had been due to borrower fecklessness. Borrowers in the Third World had willingly borrowed large sums at relatively low floating interest rates, taking on themselves and their countries the risk that monetary policy might tighten and the prices of their exports might fall. Monetary policy was tightened as a result of Paul Volcker's decision to fight inflation, and interest rates went way, way up, a decision echoed by other industrial core central banks. The prices of their exports fell in the recession of 1982. Much of the borrowed money turned out to have been used not for productive investment, but to finance government deficits or support elite consumption. But it wouldn't have mattered if it had been used for productive investment, because they had taken on the risks, and the risks had come due, and the countries had to suffer as a result, had to reduce their own incomes so that they could reduce their own demand for imports enough to finance the export surplus they needed to pay back the debt at the new, much higher interest rate and at the unfavorable exchange rate. The second financial crisis, the collapse of the Western European system of fixed exchange rates in 1992, also provoked few thoughts of systemic failure. The Conservative government of Britain and governments of other countries that had effectively pegged their currency to the German mark had claimed their commitment to their exchange rate peg was near absolute, that they would accept a considerable domestic recession rather than abandon the peg. When conflict between the German government and the Bundesbank over the financing of the absorption of East Germany to West Germany led to a substantial rise in interest rates, the governments of Italy, Britain, Sweden, and others were faced with a choice between severe domestic recession and abandoning their peg to the market, because it turned out that their promises that they would maintain the peg were not believed. Markets judged the commitment to the peg unbelievable and placed heavy one-way bets on devaluation. With the markets betting on devaluation, the costs of not devaluing became very high. There are few things that are worse than attempting to maintain a credible commitment to an incredible policy. And markets were right, and so the pattern was set. Yet somehow the belief there needed to be institutional reforms to keep financial disorder from deranging the global economy, and tighter regulation of the financial structure in which finance was leading to much, much more hot money sloshing around the world did not gain purpose. The response in Europe was that we needed to have a stronger, more ironclad commitment to stable exchange rates. The euro, we needed not just to peg currencies to each other, but actually to make Europe one currency. And as for financial regulation, financiers and financial regulators were uninterested. And so pressures that would lead to the near repeat of the Great Depression in 2008 and 2010 that turned out into the Great Recession, such pressures built.